Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Roosevelt University's second annual Martin Luther King Jr. commencement ceremony. My name is Jamar Orey. I'm the Vice President of Student Affairs and Dean of Students here at Roosevelt, and it is my pleasure to be here with you celebrating the life of this extraordinary man. Dr. King is now a name synonymous with peace, justice, and courage. However, I think it's best that we remember him not as the iconic tower of equality and heroism that he has become and deserves to be. I think he would want us to remember him as a man, as the man behind the legend. As we wrestle today with feelings of great loss, we must remember that more than anything, King was a person, a father, a son, a husband, and a friend. You see, we romanticize him and think of him as larger than life, almost superhuman in a way. But he was in fact just a man. He was a man whose feet ached after coming home from a days-long march. He was a man whose bruises needed tending after being beaten and jailed in Birmingham. And he was a man who must have been terrified at the thought of not living long enough to see his children grow up. If you can, just think for a moment about the power that lives in the simplicity of his humanity. A man who was by all accounts brilliant in a world where black brilliance was an oxymoron, whose life expectation could have been to simply follow in his father's footsteps and just be a local preacher, who was suddenly propelled into the forefront by his fellow clergy to lead what by any estimation of past efforts would have been a foolish movement, at best, and a death warrant at worst. In a church planning meeting, someone yelled out, "Well, what about Martin?" A then 26-year-old pastor, still inexperienced and untested, was chosen to lead a movement against a system that had long fought against any check on its power and supremacy. That 26-year-old went on to change the world. That he could, in his humanly vessel, summon the collective strength of thousands to push against the forces of hatred, oppression, supremacy, and terror somehow seems impossible. If we see him as a figure beyond the human experience, we let ourselves off of the hook. We can then say, well, I couldn't do that. I'm just one person. What can I do to change things? What difference could I make? So as we sit here and remember this extraordinary man, we must remember that he was in fact just a human being. And much like us, he was capable of extraordinary things. So extraordinary that we, because of him, can believe that we have the power to change the world. We can create a reality fashioned from Dr. King's very own dreams about who we have the potential to become. So with that, I welcome you and I thank you for joining us as we celebrate the life and the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So thank you. First, who will lead us off in the vocal performance, I'd like to welcome Jayla Lawrence from the Black Student Union to come with this song.
Hi, everybody. Oh, this is low. Or should I don't know if I should. Can y'all hear me? Yes. Okay. I'll be singing Lift Every Voice and sing for you guys. So, whew. Here we go. Can I sing it off? Can I do that? I'm like, I don't know if that's allowed. Okay. Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring, ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high as the listening skies. Let it resound loud as the rolling sea. Sing a song song full of the faith that the dark past has brought us. Sing a song full of the hope that the presence has brought us. Facing the rising sun, a new day beguns. Let us march on till victory is won. Stony the road we trod, bitter the chastening rod, felt in the day that hope unborn had died. Yet with the steady beat have not our weary feet come to the place on which our Father sighed. We have come over a way with the tears has been watered. We have come treading our path through the blood of the slaughtered, out of the gloomy past, till now we stand at last, where the white gleam of our star is cast. God of our weary years, God of our silent tears, thou who hast brought us this far on the way, thou who hast by thine might led us into the light. Keep us forever in the path, we pray. Lest our feet stray from the place that our God's where we meet thee. Lest our heart, drunk with the wine of the world, we forgot thee. Shadow beneath thy hand, may we forever stand. True to our God, true to our native land.
All right, let's give it up one more time for Jayla. That was amazing. Thanks so much, Jayla. Next to the stage, we will have Mr. Corey Simpson with a spoken word performance.
I think that was like the wrong way to get on stage, honestly. Yeah. I'm gonna practice that. But thank you guys for having me. One thing that if I were to say, if I had something in common with Dr. King, it would be that I consider the dream to be an if. And I like to ask a lot of questions, a lot of if questions. And that's what a lot of my poems are based on, just the random questions that come about. So this is entitled, What If King Drive Could Speak? It amazes me how they made a maze of me. Learned to embrace the shade of me, but hated in the shade at least. The idea is fun. They say life is but a dream, and I've had some. Not many have come true, but some have, though, and that's the burning bond between me and you. See, my streets, they've been paved with the good intentions and the strong backs of minorities, houses made for the middle class, apartments for the majority. I've found boulevard to be a better term because we lack drive. If there was ever a time we needed a dream, it's now. If there was ever a people that needed a dream, it's the ones that live on my name. We will not be reduced to the homes of McDonald's and a currency exchange. It was never my intent to be braggadocious, but surely if I've lived up to the praise you've raised, wouldn't land in my name hold a little bit more value? I wonder, was I considered when the only historically black university was threatened to close, and it's the only one with my name in the address? Somehow, every year, we remember the dream, but forget about the South Side. No longer should my corners be the homes of vigils of our loved ones. No longer will my concrete be paved with the faces of the innocent by the hands of the unjust. The only thing that I've known to be correct about the law to this day is that in God we trust. We believe in the same God, but somehow it seems we've been deemed unfit for the same blessings. I've been deceived from being taught to believe that any part of the Constitution was conceived with you and me in mind. We're constantly unseen. So we protest and we sing. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. Seldom is there a quiet night. Often sirens passing by. Seeping through your window crease, we stay awake, there is no peace. So how are we to dream if we could never go to sleep? Thank you.
Thanks so much, Corey. That was amazing. Next, we will have Pamela Thompson-Hill, who is the director of the Multicultural Student Support Services Center, come up and introduce our keynote speaker.
Good afternoon, everybody. I am honored today to be able to introduce our keynote speaker, Attorney Audra Wilson, Executive Director of the League of Women Voters of Illinois. Attorney Wilson began her legal career as a welfare advocacy staff attorney with the Sargent Shriver National Center on Poverty Law, where for 5 years she focused on food security issues and advocacy for low-income working families. She was soon thrust squarely into the world of politics when she was tapped by then State Senator Barack Obama to serve as the Deputy Press and Policy Director of his U.S. Senate campaign. After the U.S. Senate race, Wilson spent 7 years on the faculty at Northwestern University, Pritzker School of Law, as an adjunct professor and Director of Diversity, Education, and Outreach. In addition to launching several major diversity initiatives, Wilson developed and taught a seminar analyzing the history of U.S. welfare programs and the impact of social attitudes on contemporary welfare policy. In 2013, Wilson accepted a position as Deputy Chief of Staff for United States Congresswoman Robin Kelly in the 2nd Congressional District of Illinois. Later, in October of 2018, Wilson began her work as the new Executive Director of the League of Women Voters of Illinois. As a public interest attorney with the depth of experience in poverty law and diversity, Wilson was uniquely positioned to lead the organization whose mission is to further democracy where every person has the desire, the right, the knowledge, and the confidence to participate. Wilson was quoted as saying that, "I believe that empowered voters are the best defense of our democracy." Adding to this list of accomplishments, in October 2019, Wilson was also appointed as chair of the Cook County Commission on Women's Issues by Cook County Board Director President Tony Preckwinkle. This year marks the 100th anniversary of the League of Women Voters as they carry on their nonpartisan stance by empowering voters to play a critical role in democracy while also continuing to blaze the path for women to be able to effectively carry out their responsibilities as voters. We are happy to have Attorney Wilson with us today, and would everyone please join me in giving her a warm welcome as our keynote speaker.
All right. Put you up there. Hello. Thanks so much for having me, and thank you for the very warm introduction. I always cringe when it's like Attorney Wilson. I'm like, oh. But I do appreciate it. So, and also Jayla and Corey, that was wonderful. So it was. Thank you so much. Yes. Those are always the parts of the celebration I like the most. Anything with spoken word, music. I mean, this part's the boring part, but but thank you so much for joining us. So I have a speech, but anyone who knows me knows I tend to be a little bit off the cuff. So there are some parts that I'm going to read off of my speech because I want to give you a little bit of a history lesson as we're talking about women's suffrage in Illinois, because as we're all here in Illinois, and I imagine most of you are Illinoisans, some native, some of us are transplants, I think there's a lot of the women's suffrage story that people don't know about. So that part I might be a bit on script, but the rest I really like to have a discussion, an interaction, because that's just kind of my background. I think I love having interactions and discussions and dialogue, and I think that's how we all really learn, as opposed to having me just sit there and just, lecture you. So, but I do want to tell you a little bit about who we are as an organization, and in the process, I guess you'll learn a little bit more about me. But the League of Women Voters of Illinois, we are a very special institution, not only in the state of Illinois, but a national one. And so I'm really excited to be at the helm. It's been a year and a few months that I've been executive director. And it's an organization that many people have heard of, but they're not quite sure what we do. And then there's some misinterpretation of our name because they hear women and they think it's just a women's organization. So just to give you some background about it, the League of Women Voters is actually an organization that was born out of a decades-long fight for women's suffrage. And so the League was actually founded by one of the pivotal suffrage leaders in the United States, Carrie Chapman Catt, at the Congress Hotel, meaning next door, on February 14th of 1920. So, and it's during the convention of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. So we are excited to be about to celebrate our 100th anniversary in the place of our birth, in the room of our birth, and you're all invited, but I'll tell you more about that. But today, the League is a national, nonpartisan grassroots organization, and we are of the opinion that active and engaged citizens, irrespective of gender, ethnicity, or political affiliation, are the hallmark of any democracy. And that's what governs us, that's what guides us. And our name is really more of a tribute to our origin as that mighty political experiment. If you ever look at our website, we were a mighty political experiment designed to help 20 million women carry out their new responsibilities as voters. Now, though it's a very proud beginning of history, the fact remains, though, we talk about women's suffrage as this is the 100th anniversary of it, so you're going to be hearing a lot about that all throughout the year, 100 years of women's suffrage. The fact of the matter is it took another 45 years before the passage of the Voting Rights Act. So though the League was pivotal and instrumental in that suffrage movement, there was clearly a lot more to be done. And that's why we are where we are today. 100 years later, as I was talking to Jamar in our podcast, he first asked me, well, 100 years old and 100 years later, what can you say about that? And I said, well, all of you should be a little bit disturbed by the fact that 100 years later, we're still having many of the same conversations. And though it may not be necessarily about just educating this new 20 million people about how to exercise their right to vote, today we're worried about how we're protecting the rights of Americans to be able to cast their ballots and to preserve that hallowed right to vote. That's why 100 years later, I'm excited and saddened to say that we are still relevant and we're still here because that fight continues. But more about that later. So it's not a coincidence that we're here in Ida B. Wells' room, adjacent to a parkway that was recently renamed for Ida B. Wells. in a city that has benefited so greatly from her courageousness, her tenacity, her intellect, and her leadership. And she factors very heavily into the story of women's suffrage. And interestingly, as we're talking more about the legacy of women's suffrage, hers are one of the voices that have been really brought to the forefront, because for many, many years, for many decades, hers was one of the voices that was omitted in her contributions. And so I'm using her as sort of the backdrop for a little discussion about women's suffrage. At the end of all this, by the way, I'm going to turn this to you and ask questions, and hope that you ask questions of me and of each other, because I do think it's worthy of a discussion and a dialogue. It's not just about me. But now here's the part that I'm going to give you a little bit of background. So the Illinois women's suffrage movement began in 1855 with the formation of the state's first suffrage association in Earlville, which is a small town in LaSalle County, west of Chicago. And there were suffrage conventions that were held in 1869 and linked early to Illinois suffrage activism to the national movement. And they resulted in the formation of the first statewide suffrage organization, the Illinois Women's Suffrage Association. Now, as a transplant to Illinois, I was really excited to read about this history, because in many ways, this state has been at the forefront a lot of activist movements. So I was really proud to see our role in the suffrage movement. And I think it's not a coincidence that we are born here and celebrating 100 years of activism. So the national suffrage movement was divided in the years following the Civil War over issues and strategies, including whether African American men should be granted suffrage via the 15th Amendment. In addition, there were some suffrage activists that believed that the way to attain suffrage was through a state-by-state approach and partial suffrage measures. And others pressed for a federal amendment granting full suffrage, emphasizing the vote as a woman's constitutional right of citizenship. And the reconciliation of these different schools of thought would not take place until the formation of the National American Women's Suffrage Association in 1890. And that's the convention I just told you about that happened at the Congress Hotel. So in 1891, the Illinois state legislature passed a law allowing women to vote for elective school offices. And this renewed suffrage activism in the state. Under the leadership of Elizabeth Harbert, the IWSA adopted its new name, the Illinois Equal Suffrage Association, or the IESA, and transformed its mission from political equality with men to political enfranchisement of women. And in 1894, this elite Chicago Women's Club established a separate organization to work for the vote, the Chicago Political Equality League. So again, you have a rich legacy and history right here in Chicago. Now, between 1902 and 1910, the CPEL and other Chicago activist women groups mobilized around the charter reform movement, believing that a new municipal charter would give Chicago greater control over its internal affairs and enfranchise Chicago's women. Now, ultimately, it was not successful, but the attempt to achieve municipal suffrage, so suffrage within the city, succeeded in mobilizing nearly 100 Chicago women's groups in support of suffrage. And this included Chicago Women's Trade Union League, which encouraged support among workers and immigrants, and what many of you may have heard of, the Alpha Suffrage Club, which activist Ida B. Wells Barnett organized among African American women. So just to show you why her legacy is so important. Turning over, here we go. So I'm moving forward a little bit, but Illinois women won the right to vote with the passage of the Presidential Suffrage Bill, or Illinois Law, in 1913. And with the passage of this law, Illinois became the first state east of the Mississippi to give women the right to vote. And the legislation granted Illinois women the vote in federal and municipal elections not otherwise restricted in the Illinois Constitution to men. And this included presidential electors. So this meant that in 1916, Illinois women were effectively voting for president. Illinois activists and their important victory in 1913 helped propel the national movement towards the ultimate goal, a federal amendment granting full suffrage to women, which was attained in 1920. Now, there's a lot of back and forth about who was the actual first state to ratify, but I am proud to say that Illinois was the first state to ratify the 19th Amendment on June 10th, 1919. If any of you are from Wisconsin, you've lost this battle by minutes because our Wisconsin folks said, no, it's us. And it's like, well, technically, as we're looking, so several states did ratify on the same day, but Illinois in the history books was actually the first time-wise. So sorry, Wisconsin folks. So we ratified the 19th Amendment, which prohibited the denial of the right to vote on the basis of sex, and it also led to the rapid succession of state ratification until the 36th and final state, Tennessee, on August 28th of 1920. And I'm throwing in some of these dates too, because when you'll hear some commemorative dates and some of the stuff that will happen when you see us commemorating our league achievements, these are significant dates. So June 10th from last year was our 100th anniversary of that ratification, and then August 28th of 1920, or now 2020, will be that 100 years. So I sometimes get our national folks a little bit frustrated with me because I claim Illinois to be the flagship of the League of Women Voters. So I'm like, we're the flagship league. And I still claim it. So any National League folks, yes, it is a flagship. But you should know, in terms of our infrastructure, there are leagues all across the country. And there are state leagues all across the country. And then in Illinois itself, and many other states, but speaking of Illinois, we have over 3,700 members and over 41 local league chapters. So we call them local leagues. So we are truly a statewide organization. And what I love about the structure of our organization is that we're governed, obviously, by the same principles. We have generally the same bylaws, but every municipality and area is able to tailor the activities of the local league based on what's happening in their communities. And so that makes us a very unique organization. And so we are growing and getting close to 4,000 members, and always looking for more members, especially younger members, more diverse members, because those voices are so important in this discussion of how we preserve that right to vote. But we also have a challenging history as well, which I kind of alluded to in the beginning. It wasn't just about pushing for women's suffrage. I mean, again, another 45 years it took before passage of the Voting Rights Amendment. And why that's so important is that we can't forget that this fight for suffrage is and has always been inextricably tied to the terrible legacy of racial subjugation and class warfare. So you can't have a discussion about one without the other. And that is something that, a lot of folks don't feel comfortable talking about. I am so excited to be head of the league and working with league members who, unlike sometimes other people in different organizations, are much more accepting of their history and recognizing that we have some great successes. As we're looking at this year of commemoration, that we have to acknowledge the fact, what was our role in this? And why were we not advocating as hard for making sure that right to vote was truly the right to vote for all? One area, for example, that was controversial was how women got the right to vote. What sort of decisions and what sort of horse trading, as we like to call it when we're working on the Hill, was being done to ensure that right to vote. So for those of you who have done any sort of women's history or suffrage history, including Carrie Chapman Catt, and this is where I can get a little bit glib, Morgan, my staffer, knows this very well, but I first started the league, and one of the first things I got drawn into was this conversation, this argument about Carrie Chapman Catt, who again is a pivotal suffragist, suffragist. You'll see why I'm laughing in a second, but the discussion I was drawn into was whether Carrie Chapman Catt was a racist. And I'm like, okay, why am I being drawn to this discussion? And specifically was this notion of what sort of decisions and compromises were made to convince males, and particularly in the South, to vote for women's suffrage. And one of the decisions that was made was, quite frankly, to appeal to preserving white supremacy. And that was and what's especially unique about this is you have to understand the women's suffrage movement was born out of the abolitionist movement. So it seems a bit contradictory. If we're born out of the abolitionist movement, then why are we having conversations about preserving white supremacy as an argument to garner the right to vote for all women? And I had to remind my league members, because they were passionate about it. I mean, even to the point where they're like, maybe we shouldn't honor her and we shouldn't have awards that are named after her. And so the irony to have me, of all people, saying, hold on a second, wait a minute. I had to remind them that, you can't decontextualize history. That was simply an example of the fact that you cannot extricate race and class from this discussion. And this was the reality at the time, that the sad irony is that probably the single biggest way that you were able to mobilize that right to vote in southern states and places that would not otherwise have gone for the right for women to vote was this argument and appealing to that basis instinct that if we would be able to preserve white hegemony and white supremacy if in fact women are granted that right to vote. And that caused a lot of rifts, quite frankly, within the women's suffrage movement, especially Ida B. Wells and Mary Church Terrell and other activists, not just black women, but all different types of women of color, and a split among these activists. Like, wait a minute, you were our friends and our partners in the abolitionist movement, and now here we are, on opposite sides as we're determining how we move forward. But that is part of our history, and it's something that we have to embrace and we have to talk about. But what I remind my league members, I'm like, that it's also part of American history, and unfortunately, if anyone knows anything about legislation and policy making, there are some of these almost deals with the devil that are made. So to look critically now at those decisions and whether they should have been made, to me, was not a useful exercise. What's more important is, once that right to vote was granted, once it was obtained and achieved, what did we do as an organization to move the needle forward? So that is something that we really take very seriously, especially now that we're looking at commemoration, 2020, how we move forward as an organization. And it's something that I'm really proud that the national organization, as well as our state organization and many state organizations, have really taken to heart. I always remind my league members that, if our mission is to empower voters and protect democracy and preserve democracy, you can't do it as an organization it's homogenous. You can't do it as an organization where it is, and they're self-deprecating. This is not me saying this, but many of my members will say people think we're just a group of older white women or older white privileged women. And what I also love about my league members is that they're really sensitive to that and recognize, like, we aren't really fulfilling our mission if we continue to look the way we look. And so that's why we have really made an effort to make sure that we are reaching out to every single community. We're reaching out to different kinds of people. And we are, so younger people, different backgrounds, different affiliations, all of whom have come together and are mobilizing behind the importance of preserving our right to vote and why it's so important for us to vote. So I'm really proud of the organization, how far it's come, and how it's embraced its legacy and its mixed legacy. And that's really important because there's so much more fighting that we have left to do. You've heard this before. It cannot be understated. There are a lot of attacks that are happening right now to our American democracy. And this is not hyperbole. It really is the truth. You're lucky to be in a state and to be in a city that in many ways, though it's had its challenges, is far more progressive. And talks about these sorts of things and has a really strong sense of activism and a strong history of activism, and that's why I love Chicago so much. And that's such an important thing to remember because, quite frankly, in a lot of our peer states, our neighbors, our friends, and many of you have family from all around the country, it's not necessarily that way. I mean, there are all sorts of schemes that are in place to disempower voters happening all the time. And unfortunately, we're living in a time with an administration that has been so hostile to a good chunk of the American populace and is making active efforts to disengage and to disenfranchise as many people as possible, and overtly so. That's what kind of scares me. It's not even trying to hide anymore. So when we talk about putting additional protections in place for ID, when at least 3 different administrations, Republican and Democrat, have done these studies that have shown that there is no rampant voter fraud. So under Republican and Democratic administrations who have done this study have not been able to find the rampant voter fraud that seems to underscore all of these schemes. This is when it becomes very insidious. It's like, no, our goal is to disenfranchise. And then what happens how that gets translated to you all, particularly as students, is going into your minds, making you think that your vote isn't important. that it doesn't matter, that it doesn't really count. And why should I be out there? And quite frankly, that campaign in the mind is probably the scariest thing. I mean, it's one thing to have lawyers like me going out and fighting the fight to get rid of the laws and the books, but it's a different thing when there's a kind of psychological warfare going on. And how do we convince people that no, that it's not true? So when Jamar and I were talking during our podcast, one of the things that I said was, it is so important, that right to vote, especially at the most local level. So for those of you, whether you live in Chicago or you come from smaller communities, the people who influence your life the most, quite frankly, are your trustees, your mayors, your library boards, your school boards. These are individuals who are making decisions that actually impact your daily lives, much more so, quite frankly, than a president, or for me, I worked for the House. I mean, don't get me wrong, my federal lawmaker was doing very important things and important advocacy, and I was proud to be with her during that. But quite frankly, if you were to tell me how do I rank in terms of, who has the most influence in my daily life, it would not be her, nor would it be a president. So that's why when I tell you every single vote counts, if you've ever looked at these totals of votes, when people win or lose by 2, 3, 5, or 10 votes, then you can't tell me that every vote doesn't count. And so it's so important for you to make sure that you're getting out, you're talking to your families, you're talking to folks in your community, you are engaging as many people as possible, using organizations like the League as a resource, because one of our big things is about voter education. We need active and engaged citizens, but education is a key part of that. We host a lot of candidates forums, and they're candidates for you can hear every single candidate at every level of government and hear what they have to say. And I always remind people, you need to be out there and you need to ask the people who want to represent you in whatever level of government, you got to ask them the tough questions. You have to look at their records. You have to say, I notice your voting pattern in your records, but it seems kind of contrary to X, Y, and Z values of our community. Why is that? Never take any elected official for granted simply because they have the same letter, a D, a R, or an I in front of their name as you might, because that's sometimes what gets us in trouble. We just vote the party lines and we vote the ticket and we don't ask any sort of questions. Jamar also asked me another question that I thought I should share with you, because I'm glad that he said it to me. He said, we have a lot of really active and engaged younger people. So I'm a Gen Xer. I'm not a boomer. Just saying. Gen Xers. For those of you out there, yay, Gen X. But there's a lot of younger people, millennials and Gen Zs, and I don't even know what my daughter is. Is she a Gen Z? She's an 11-year-old. I don't even know what generation she is. But it's funny because she's very active and engaged too, probably because her parents drag her everywhere to these things. But we have to be just as careful in our advocacy for not blasting or denigrating those who may have voted for people that we might say, why did you cast your vote for this person? That's silly, and why would you vote against your self-interest? There's a lot more at stake. One of the things that I talk about with the League, what makes us so unique as a nonpartisan organization, is I have to remind myself that people filter kind of life, or look at life, or filter life through their own life experiences. So how they interpret things, how they react to things, depends upon what their life experiences are. And this even goes for your parents. So sometimes our parents will make these sort of decisions that we want to roll our eyes and think like, that's the dumbest thing, and why would you say that, and why would you support so-and-so, and that's ridiculous. But I remind people, I'm like, don't just automatically shut them down, ridicule them, make them feel dumb for that. You have to be a little bit more compassionate and look at them and more and understand what is it that's resonating with them, because again, we go back to our history of racial subjugation, prejudice, discrimination. Unfortunately, we have an administration that taps into our basest fears and does a lot of the othering and fear mongers and scares people. So people really are acting in their self-interest. They're reacting to fear and conjecture and circumstances that don't actually exist. And that's what guides them to think a certain way and to cast their votes a certain way. I do a lot of radio, and people ask me all the time about the number of women that voted for the current administration, and white women, and they're the reason why we are where we are. And I'm like, okay, I'm not going to get into this back and forth, but I always remind them, things are definitely changing, because I've been looking at a lot of polls and statistics. by The Hill and other sources that are talking about how in this election there may not be that wave that there was before. There might be some people who are really now thinking like, we have to make a different choice, and we have to be more educated and more careful about how we cast our ballot, because now they're recognizing that there are things that are impacting my own self-interest. And so you all can be the change for that. You can be the catalyst for that, helping people recognize what really is at stake and removing all the othering and saying, let's talk more about how any person that you're looking to vote for is actually going to impact you personally and more directly. You can help them filter through all the noise of the cable channels and all the very partisan talks, and you can have them really have an intelligent kind of conversation and discussion and get people really thinking about, well, why am I just reflexively casting my ballot a certain way? You actually do have the power to do that, and I know it sounds so Pollyanna-ish, but I am perennially a glass is half full person, and I really do believe that. So you have a lot more power than you think you do, and you have to wield that power because there is so much at stake. So that's why I hope that even in our conversation today, and as we're sort of brainstorming and thinking about how we move forward, you at least acknowledge and recognize your power to make an influence and make a difference in upcoming elections, not only at the national level and the federal level, but locally, because you are that powerful. So with that, I'm going to actually open the floor to comments or questions, because again, I like hearing from my audience and what they have to say, or maybe just, especially as we're thinking of Dr. King's legacy and what their thoughts are about why that right to vote is so sacred and so hallowed, and actually why they're here today. I'd love to know why people have come today to even hear this discussion.
Okay, so there's so much important, not just the presidential, other elections. That's a lot of work to find that information on each person. What would you say is the best way to find out where everyone stands on the issues, and also issues that are important to you?
So there's a lot of different ways to do so. If you're coming through our organization, League of Women Voters, we have what we call our Illinois Voter Guide. And it's a really wonderful and unique tool. And what it is, basically, you can go with the Illinois Voter Guide, you can look up whatever municipal election, and you get to see kind of profiles of the candidates, you get to see what their platform and their positions are. And it's one of the first places I tell people to go, because before you cast your ballot, you need to educate yourself, and you need to learn as much about candidates as you possibly can. And so the Illinois Voter Guide is a great tool to use. And people use it all the time as they're sort of figuring out, okay, this is who I'm going to vote for, and here's why, and so we encourage you to do that. Another source that I tell people to use, it's not so much about the endorsements. We know newspapers like to do endorsements, but some newspapers and some media outlets will actually do candidate profiles, and those are important too, to learn where they stand in the issues, and I encourage you to listen to them. I really do. Because they can be very probative. You can learn a lot more about the candidates from what they're saying, and oftentimes what they're not saying. Because I think every candidate, and I've worked for many candidates, I've done extensive work in politics, but I say the same thing, notwithstanding my own leanings. Like, you must ask tough questions of everybody. These are individuals that you are voting to represent your interests. So it would behoove you to ask the toughest questions, and anyone who would bristle and not want to hear about what your thoughts are, you should worry about that. You should be very concerned about that. And even within my own political party, I've had my representatives at certain levels where I've sat there saying, I'm not comfortable with having you as my representative. And not that I would necessarily cross party lines, but I certainly am not going to just not say anything and not call you to task for not, standing up for what I believe in or not advocating for what I believe in. So it's really important for you to do that education. But to your point, it can be really challenging because there's a lot of folks out there. And at the municipal level, it can be especially challenging because federal candidates and maybe your state senators and state senators, it's easier to find information about them. But it's not always easy to see the background of your trustee or of your library board. So you might have to do a little bit more digging. We have a thing called Observer Corps where we have our league members that actually, because we're also about good governance, and we want to make sure that we're observing meetings, making sure that procedures and policies are followed. So we're the ones, we've got big old buttons sitting in the back, literally just observing meetings. And when we see things that are happening that shouldn't be happening, or if people aren't getting the requisite amount of time to be able to stand up and speak, we're making notations of that. And then we will go back to that body and say, we noticed the 5 things that you did not do, the protocols you did not follow according to the rules and regulations or Open Meetings Act or whatever the case may be. But I say that to say that if you haven't actually gone to a local or a municipal meeting, a community meeting, and a school board meeting, you should do that as well. And they're so eye-opening. You can learn so much. And then you realize how much stuff is happening and decisions that are being made that, quite frankly, they're being made open to the public, but so many of us don't go. And we don't educate ourselves. We don't learn about this. And then we turn around and complain, thinking things were done under cover of darkness. No, they weren't. We just never go. We never went. And we didn't think to go. And so I'm telling you now, I hope this is not a secret, but if it is, here's the secret. You need to go to these meetings as well and listen and participate and get up on the mic and say something. That's how change is made. So it really is as grassroots as it gets. Yes.
So, as an attorney, I wanted to ask you a question about the ERA.
Mm-hmm.
So, moving forward with 38 states now ratifying it.
Yep.
What is the next legal fight with it? What challenges do you see? And do you think it will become the 28th Amendment?
So, really good question about the ERA, especially with passage in Virginia. So the fight for the ERA has been decades long. For those of you who are aspiring law students, when you're learning about the process of amendments to the Constitution, you'll learn these are very long, drawn-out processes. That's why there are so few, relatively speaking. The challenge is that, and this is the debate that's going on, and I'm not as well versed in this as some other attorneys, but I will tell you that part of the problem was that there was at least an arbitrarily or artificially imposed time limit for ratification. And so now that we have the requisite 38 states, the question is, but it was outside of this time limit for ratification. And I've heard that there have been some states that have actually, I don't know if this is really true or not, but have questioned whether or not they wanted to rescind their ratification. Not that that's even possible to do, but that there has been some discussion of that. So the 38th state ratifying is a very big deal. And for lawyers who are arguing for passage of the ERA, this is a very significant thing. But there's going to be a lot of legal challenges. The biggest one being, is there any validity, meaning legal validity or necessity to adhere to this timeline, or is it really artificial? Which is probably the first thing that's going to have to be figured out. I am, always optimistic. I think the passage of the 38th state was a big deal. Maybe in this political environment and climate too, because we're in a very different time than we were before. I think the momentum will still keep going. So I'm not of the opinion that simply because we're outside of this time frame for ratification that necessarily disqualifies all the work and advocacy that's happened over like the past 5 decades. So hopefully be more optimistic. That's definitely something that I'd love to talk to more of my kind of constitutional lawyers about too, about what do they see about that. But that's the next fight though. Okay. Yes.
How you doing? My name is Troy.
Hey, Troy. That's my nephew's name. Hi, Troy.
My question is, do you see similar patterns within institutional policy that effectuate social closure that you've seen in a suffrage movement and a women's rights movement?
So when you say social closure, give me an example.
Social closure as economic for women, housing, education, all the apparatuses that's used to mold us into citizens.
Yes. So that's a really good question. Absolutely. There are definite parallels. Not only are there parallels, it's like they're also overlapping circles. You know, these different movements they're overlapping, they're inspiring each other. And yes, there are things to be learned in different movements that inspire and underscore other movements. So absolutely, I do see those. For the League, for example, to give you a local issue that has been a big thing for us has been the push for affordable housing and advocacy about that. Not only are we focusing locally, but our conversations with our peers across the country about kind of what that movement is to push for affordable housing, even to the pie in the sky, affordable housing as a human right, to kind of some of the more local and sort of pragmatic and basic issues of just affordability so people aren't getting gentrified and kind of pushed out of communities. So yes, I absolutely think that there's a lot of synergy between these movements. I'm trying to think of the civil rights movement, quite frankly, I don't want to say it's the catalyst because of the time frame in which it came, but it certainly has been a huge motivator of a lot of modern and contemporary movements. The legacy of Dr. King, obviously, and his advocacy, which quite frankly, you think about it, again, 50 years later, it's almost like I was reading some quotes and other things from Dr. King, and if you close your eyes and listen to the quote, you don't know that it was said 5 decades ago, because it is contemporary, it is real. So the civil rights movement, again, underscores a lot of the movements that you're talking about. So a lot of them, I think, modern movements have their genesis, quite frankly, in the civil rights movement. But yes, they are working collaboratively, they are there. And that's really another important point that you made too, is that sometimes when we're looking at all these different movements, and I think this is what happened when, I have to be very mindful of the hat that I'm wearing, not to get too much into politics in terms of partisan politics, but I was on a radio program and they asked me, why I thought Hillary lost, and and why don't we have our first woman president, and what was happening, and I had a sort of rare, less league, more personal moment, and I said, I think there's a danger of when we get into identity politics, when we're appealing to every group and only speaking to that group, and we don't talk about how the groups intersect and how our movements intersect, and how I can be concerned about an issue, but I can still support you on an issue because I see where there's that intersection. If you're only speaking singularly to a particular group, then what ends up happening is that's a lot that you're asking, because then when they say, okay, well, I might cast my vote for you, but how are you going to help me? I don't care about these other people. I don't care about these other movements. I only care about my own. That's a lot, and you put yourself out there, and I think that was a danger when you get into too far into identity politics and you don't talk about how do we all intersect, while recognizing that each one of us might have a particular issue that resonates with our particular community. But if you don't talk about those points of intersection, and I'm also speaking as someone who's worked legislatively that says it doesn't work like that. Compromise is always the key. But you get yourself in trouble. So I remind people who are working in different movements to not lose sight of where your movement fits in with someone else. Where is there synergy? How can we be supportive of each other, or how can we at least not step on each other's toes?
Hi, my question would be, how do you, what would you say, or how do you encourage young Black people who have given up on voting and the process of the system because they feel like it takes too long, or there is really no impact in their vote? How do you, what would be your attack on that?
So that's a tough question, because it's something that we're faced with all the time, and I do a lot of political work. And I wrestle, especially being the head of the organization where I am, because I have the party line about voting is this, and I speak the platitudes and sound so good for the cameras. But how do I have a real practical conversation with someone that, especially if what they're looking at is their neighborhood and their community and seeing things languish and fall apart and whatever, so my words sound kind of hollow, but I do think I like to, at least for me, so I'm going to speak for myself, I love to engage in dialogues and discussions with individuals. And I guess the narrative or the alternative that I give them is, you're talking about, well, first of all, there's a presumption that my vote doesn't count because you presume that everyone is voting. And I like to remind people, no, as a matter of fact, the problem is not enough people are voting. So you're presuming that people are voting, even if it's not me individually and nothing's happening, but I'm always like, no, that's problem number one, a presumption that, number one, that's incorrect. Number two, I try to make sure people understand who are the influencers, who are the individuals that have to be moved or motivated and influenced to be able to make any change in those communities. And that does require voting. And I also try to give them some strategies about how they can really agitate and get people to really listen. Now, I'm going to tell you a secret about voting, and it's going to sound really weird, but you have to hear me very carefully about this. For those of you who've worked in elections, you've worked in campaigns, you may have supported family members, friends, whomever who are running for office. Sometimes it's important that you lose. And how you lose, quite frankly, can influence how you're going to win and really make a difference. People sometimes want that instant gratification, and this is where a generational thing. I found, as a society, we always want to feel the fruits of our labor. I find that with younger generations, the people who are younger than me, can feel very disenfranchised and unmotivated when they feel like I've been doing out there advocating and I'm working so hard, and I don't see the fruits of my labor because whatever I was advocating for didn't change. The law didn't pass, the ordinance didn't pass, I wasn't able to overturn something, therefore we failed. And I keep trying to tell people, I'm like, no, you didn't. You are moving the needle and you are making advances, even though you may not have gotten as far as you needed to get. And quite frankly, if you're looking and really doing your history about the civil rights movement, that should be the perfect example of that. How incremental change was. Yes, we see things on TV and there was huge kind of groundswell and movement, but the civil rights movement wasn't just what you saw in a finite period of time for a few years with Dr. King on TV. This was decades long, and they were very incrementally moving the needle. And they had just as many, and I won't call them failures, but things that they weren't as successful in that first incarnation or the second or third, but make no mistake, it moved the needle. And that's the sort of mentality that I try to impress upon people, that you've got to abandon this notion that simply because I stand out there and I protest and I wave a sign that it's going to get fixed like that, because it won't. And quite frankly, that's sort of an insult to the legacy of freedom riders and freedom fighters and civil rights activists who will tell you who got beaten and kicked and tear gas and all that stuff, to see certain changes in their lifetime and some that they didn't, but quite frankly, they laid the groundwork for that groundswell that came. So you can see it, for example, you've heard about in the LGBTQ advocacy with Stonewall, and they'll talk about laying the foundation. And those are people who are long gone and dead, and yet you're building upon their advocacy to where we are today. And so where do we fit into that? That's kind of the discussion that I try to have with people. I'm like, but the biggest thing I have to get people off of is like, you gotta abandon this notion that things are going to change simply because you have the loudest of voices. But it doesn't mean that your advocacy is not important. You need to agitate, you need to educate, you need to be in people's faces, but you also need some other people like me and others who are behind the scenes too, who are doing that sort of agitation in a different kind of way. It's going to take a lot of different types of advocacy to move that needle forward, but I would also tell you to encourage your peers to remind them that, hey, we are making a difference. And that's not the easiest thing to describe to people and to explain to people, but it's kind of where I begin when I'm having conversations. I'm not mincing words. I'm like, listen, I get why you're frustrated and you hate all the talking heads talking at you because you think they don't get it, but we do. But that's sort of the lesson that we try to impart, that it is making a difference. And it may take 10 years for something that you think should happen in a year or 6 months. But what you did in those 6 months is the reason why 10 years later, or even 5 years later, something moved, and you were a part of that.
Kind of somewhat on the same subject. I kind of believe, like you're saying, if I can quote you correctly, that basically it takes somebody, a group of somebody to step up and to encourage the change, or an activist, or something along the sort, a radical such as Dr. King. Do you see anybody currently within either like Chicago or locally that could possibly come forward and I guess fill those shoes, or like do you see anybody, or is there anybody that you would see on the rise as being a next social activist or a radical for women voters.
Like an individual?
Yeah.
So I'm not going to answer that directly simply for one reason. No. But no, it's not that I don't see, I see many examples of that, but that was a terrible way to answer that. I hesitate to throw out names because I don't think there's kind of singular saviors out there. I mean, I think there are individuals who are definitely vibrant and active, and they're loud, and they're out there. There are groups that I work with congressional, when I was working with Congress, that were advocating and agitating for a lot of change, especially a lot of youth-oriented groups. But it's groups, it's individuals, it's a lot of different people out there. So I don't think it's about just one or two or three or a handful. I think every person has the power to do so. I know it sounds very cliched, but the reason why I think it's important to say that is because what I'm trying to encourage people to do is to really collaborate and identify. I'm trying to think of like one youth group that I work with really closely. It's like right in the tip of my tongue. It'll hit me in just a second. But it's so Congresswoman Kelly's big platform was combating gun violence. That's what she ran on. It's been the signature issue for us. And so we would work with groups like Moms Demand Action or Kids Off the Block and these other sorts of groups. And each one of them had these sort of figureheads, like someone that's identified with that particular organization. And that's great. And, you know, they have that identity, and that's wonderful. But what I saw where there was more effectiveness is when the groups were actually talking to each other. Because sometimes a lot of these activist groups, they'll have like a dynamic leader and they're doing great things, but that dynamic leader leading that group is not interfacing or interacting with other groups that are doing similar things. And we're not thinking about, you know, working in our little silos, but rather creating that network, you know, of advocates so that we can span much farther than we could if we're just doing this singularly, you know, as just like one person leading a movement here. And you have to understand, I represented a congressional district that was city, suburb, and rural areas. It's the same issues, but it's gonna look a lot different in Kankakee than it does in Chicago. So the one influencer that might be here in Chicago doing some really amazing work, if they're not talking directly to a local organizer or a person that's more local whose name isn't as well known, but if you know who they are in their community, that they're just as influential in their communities, then something is lost. So that's why I say I really try to think about, I don't think of it in terms of what individuals, and I've had actually quite a few peers of mine who I hear them on the radio and I see them all the time, and I think they're great, but I sometimes push back on them. I'm like, you know, it's almost become all about you. And you've lost sight about, it's about the movement, it's about the issue, and how are you working with other folks? Using your power to mobilize other people as opposed to you leading something. So that's why I really kind of say that in terms of influencers, every one of you has the ability to be an influencer, but to the extent that you're working within an organization, you need to ask your organization, how does our organization interface with other organizations? How do we support and collaborate with other organizations to be more powerful? And that to me is far more powerful than a single influencer. Any other questions?
When we talk about influencers and activism, I've noticed that a lot of younger people use social media to kind of push forward and do their activism. Do you feel that that's as strong as foot soldiers are basically taking it to the streets and marching and the type of activism that we used to do back in the day?
Yes, I do. I think you need it all. I'm the head of an organization with a lot of members who are older than me and are used to a certain kind of activism, and much of the activism that you described, they are much more, and I love this, because my league members will show up. They will show up, they'll have their banners, their buttons, they'll come when the weather's terrible, or the weather's great, it doesn't matter, because they come from an era or a generation where it was boots in the ground and physically being present, and you have them outside the door registering people to vote. This is stuff you can do online. That doesn't stop them from coming. So yes, that is very important. I think there's something to be said about seeing people and touching them and interacting with them and that human contact. But in our modern era right now, we use social media. That's how many of us connect. That's how we interact. You know, I'd like to be the person that says I'm resisting using my phone and doing all this, but I'm reading it on my phone and doing a lot of that same stuff as well, and looking at social media. So you have to engage people where they are at all levels. So social media is a very, very important tool. I just think it's not the only tool. I think it's part of our big toolbox. It's part of our arsenal, and we need to be kind of deploying the troops at all different levels. So if I can reach you easily, you know, via social media, if my tweets are sort of keeping you inspired and you're following me, that's great if it's working for you. But I know that's not going to work for another group of folks. So I have to reach them where they are. So it's one of many different ways that we engage people. I would never say one is better than the other. You should never do that. It's you meet people where they are. You have to know your audience and how do they best respond. And I have my communications director, who's a queen of that too, you know, talking about but that's a quandary that we have. How do we meet our members? How do we identify new members? Our members can be engaged in a certain way. You know, Facebook for them might be it. But when we're trying to reach out to younger people like you, we also have to think, how do I encourage you to want to join our organization, and what's the best way for me to reach you? So all methods to me are as valuable. You had a question?
Hi. My question is, what are some things that a person in a position of privilege, such as myself, can do to actively advance political equality without overstepping in a way that, like, trying to speak for people that it's not my place to represent?
Oh, good question. So how to be a good ally. It's funny, your peers could probably answer that better than I can, but I would say, I've actually been asked that question by some of my league members. We've been doing implementing a lot of DEI stuff, and a very interesting situation came up when it was a woman of color, Middle Eastern descent, Muslim woman, and a white female bisexual woman who got asked to speak on a panel, be someplace, and there was it was a good discussion, but it was an interesting discussion, sort of like, well, you can't get up there and you can't speak because, you know, you don't have the same experience as I have. And so, interestingly, the white woman came to me, and she genuinely was like, you know, Audra, if you think I should bow out, I should, because she was asked to participate in something that was related to diversity. And she asked me almost permission, like, is it appropriate for me to go? And I was like, well, why are you asking me for permission for that? And then she proceeded to tell me that her counterpart, and with whom she works very closely, was sort of taken aback. Why would she get asked? And, you know, and we had a long discussion about it. And I said, you know, listen, I think there's no reason why you shouldn't be up there, except you have to be mindful of, you know, to the concern that you have of acknowledging the role that you're playing. You're there as an ally. You're there to speak about your experiences as a bisexual woman. And because that is, you know, if we're talking about diversity, that is something that does distinguish you, and you have certain experiences based off of that fact that you can relay. But all you have to be mindful of doing is just saying, I can only speak for myself and, you know, my experiences. I'm here to support. I'm here to listen. I'm here to learn. You know, and I think people are generally accepting and appreciative of that. You know, what you don't want to do, obviously, is start to, when I say speak for, it's one thing to be there and support, but, you know, you're still always there to listen and to observe and to take in and to certainly parrot that message that's being put out externally. But yes, you do have to be very mindful of your privilege and acknowledging that there are certain conversations that you can have, there are certain places you can go, and certain things that you can do that are easier for you. And I think as long as you're cognizant of that and you're sensitive about that, we appreciate that. Not to mention the fact that, and Dr. King, again, is a very important example of this. The civil rights movement and some of the great gains that were made were not made exclusively by black people. So if you've done any of your history, you would know that so when we're talking about the agitators and protesters, they were not all black. We had allies. We had individuals who stood side by side. So if anyone were to suggest that this was just a singular movement only for people of color, that is factually incorrect. And I think contemporarily, you're not going to be able to move things forward unless you have a coalition behind you. So I think your presence is as important. When I'm really being glib, I'm saying, no, I need a white guy. Come here. I need you to stand here with me. No, but whatever the case may be, I mean, it is important because the other thing, and you made me think about this, these movements that we talk about, we can talk about something that's happening. Let's say it's unique to black people. No, it's not unique. It's happening that we see to black people. But just because it might be happening to one group of people doesn't mean it doesn't influence you in some way, shape, or form. A lot of the activism that we do, we are allies because there is some influence that we see on our own communities. You think that you're not affected by neighborhoods that are overrun with crime and poverty, and not because we're inherently, poor, criminal people, but the lack of opportunity, economic opportunity, terrible schools, and and bad infrastructure, that's going to impact the city as a whole. So you do actually have some interest and some motivation to want to support other groups that are disenfranchised because you can find some sort of connection. So a lot of us like to have the blinders on, like, well, not in my neighborhood, not in my community. I don't have to think about it. Yes, you do. There is some influence. And so I think it behooves all of you to be engaged and involved. But what you do is you come in as an ally and you say, how can I be helpful? What do you need from me? What can I do to support you? And please someone else back me up to say that if people were to approach in that way, we'd be very welcoming and appreciative of that sort of assistance.
Hi, my name is Brian.
Hey, Brian.
Hi. Going back to the point on social media, earlier you mentioned how there's been sort of a psychological agenda in the last couple decades that have sort of added to the hostility amongst our society, right? It's kind of unweaved some of the social fabric there, right, that was present during King's time and during time of the 50s and 60s and all that. So my question is, what, as young adults and contributing members, all of us, what can we do to combat some of that information overload? That's kind of making us be a little hostile, right? There's an old quote that says, with information overload, it could be, it could lead to lack of attention to the issues that are, truly important. So I'm just thinking, like, what can we do in order to combat some of that misinformation?
So that's a really, really good question and this is where the generation difference comes into play. So I'm, as a Gen Xer, someone with not quite half my life without kind of social media and email, but at least a significant amount of my life without it, and then the rest with. So the problem with that information overload that you're describing is that there's a lot of misinformation overload, and it is so difficult to be able to sort between what is fact, what is fiction, what is kind of fact, kind of fiction, and sometimes it causes us to shut down. It's like, I can't take this in anymore, and it makes it hard for advocates to be able to reach out to communities and engage them, because it's like, especially younger people, because it's like, there's just so much noise to sort through. So that is a really important question. This is where this is going to sound funny, but I would really encourage you, especially because all of you in here I think of as influencers and activists in your own right, I would really strongly encourage you to kind of go back to the basics and really start to engage people who are older than you in their activism. Because a lot of them can help you sort of cut through this noise and really remind you of kind of where we've come. Because I'm a big person about not only history, but history, I think, gives a lot of context. And notwithstanding all the noise you hear, sometimes you get a lot of the answers from looking behind for a second. Like, how did we get here in the first place? It sometimes helps you define what is here. You can't tell what is here by everyone telling you what here is. Sometimes you have to do a little bit of your own sort of dive backwards to figure out how did we get here. And sometimes talking to peers and colleagues, talking to older advocates, getting some of that context can really help you sort through that noise. When you do that individually, then it's your responsibility as the influencers that you are, is to sort of relay that to your peers as well. to remind people, how do I filter out all of the noise and not reflexively react to something that I see that was tweeted? Because that's the culture that we're in right now. I mean, it's just misinformation goes out like wildfire, and sending out a correction or an acknowledgement of mistake becomes irrelevant, because at this point in time it's gone viral, and now that's yet another layer of something that we have to debunk. But I would say for you as an individual, what you need to do in your own individual path is you have to make an affirmative, positive decision that I'm going to actually step back for a second to kind of figure out how we have gotten to the situation, and go to some older sources and do some sort of research, and not always rely upon social media. And sometimes even some of, people listen to cable channels and stuff. I laugh when people talk about liberal versus kind of the conservative media. I think, quite frankly, a lot of the news just does all of us a disservice. Even the news outlets that we think parrot our own thoughts and opinions, because it's really shaping the way we're thinking and discouraging us from actually doing our own research and coming to our own conclusions. And don't think that it's just Fox News. So that's why you're in an academic setting, so I'm giving you a more academic answer, but that's going to be really important. But then you, as the folks in the academic setting, have to go out to your communities to take this newfound knowledge that you have to help people be able to figure that out as well. But there's no easy answer for that. I mean, I'm not quite sure how we counteract that noise and a lot of that misinformation. But I do know where the answers come from, though.
Thank you.
Thank you. So before we wrap up, I just want to give a plug for our 100th birthday. I want all of you to come. It is free and there is cake. So, I mean, why wouldn't you come? And it's also, because again, you guys are influencers and you're whatever, it's a great place to be able to rub elbows, because you'll be meeting a lot of your local elected officials and your state and your federal elected officials. And what I love about this, and I really invite you personally to be my guest, is because I will shout all of you out, and I'll send you, you all need to come talk to these people here, because they need to hear from your voices. So for those of you who are saying, well, how do we engage? Well, so I'm going to put you in a room with some of these folks, and it's a captive audience. And I control the audience. So, you'll have an opportunity to actually really engage them. And I want you to engage them too, because they need to hear your voices. They need to know who you are and know what issues really resonate with you, especially as we are in this political season. So if you come to our website, lwvil.org, League of Women Voters of Illinois.org, you'll see right on our front page about our birthday party, and just RSVP. All we need to know is just you're going to be there, so we can make sure we accommodate you, and plenty of cake for you. But you'll get to learn more a little bit about the League, our accomplishments. It's really going to be cool. See, Corey, you need to be there, because we got spoken word and we got quotes and stuff, so you'll love that as well. But I encourage you to come to learn more about who we are. And what you'll really love about it is that you'll see a variety of people in the room that is truly a cross-section of our country. And a lot of folks who are there from different walks of life, who we are all there because we believe in empowering voters and preserving democracy. And we don't look the same, we don't think the same, but yet we are united by that belief, and I think you'll find that very empowering. So I do hope you join us. It's on Valentine's Day, but fortunately it's only at 10 o'clock in the morning. You'll be done by 11:15, and you can spend the rest of your day with your sweeties. But thank you so much. I appreciate you having me come, and I look forward to talking to you afterwards. Thanks.
So I just want to say thank you so much for coming, Audra. It was a phenomenal speech, a great time. And plug for our podcast. It was also really great, coming out soon. So just thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
It was really good.